sun was sinking behind the jagged peaks when Ethan Cole found Daniel Ward bleeding out among the ashes of a burned-out camp. The skirmish with outlaws had been quick, brutal, and senseless, one of many that scarred the frontier. Smoke hung, thick in the air, the metallic scent of blood mingling with gunpowder. Ethan's hands shook as he pressed a torn piece of his coat to Daniel's wound, but he already knew it was too late. The bullet had gone deep, and the color was draining from his friend's face by the second. Daniel tried to speak, coughing up blood instead. Ethan bent close, desperate to catch his words. Don't let her be alone," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "Clara, my sister." Ethan's heart twisted. He'd heard Daniel speak of Clara only a few times during their service together, always with a softness rare for a man hardened by war and loss. He'd said she lived far up in the mountains, tending a small cabin left after their parents died. He'd mentioned she'd been hurt bad in a fire, though Daniel never said how. Ethan hadn't asked. Some wounds weren't his to pry open. Now, staring into Daniel's fading eyes, Ethan felt the weight of something far heavier than friendship. "Tell her I'm sorry," Daniel rasped, each word a battle. She's all I had. Promise me, Ethan, you'll look after her." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. "You'll tell her yourself, you hear? You're gonna make it." But Daniel only gave a weak smile, the kind that already belonged to another world. "No," he said softly. "You will. Promise me. You'll take care of her. Marry her if you can. She deserves better than this world's given her." The words hit Ethan like a blow. Marry her. He wanted to refuse, to tell Daniel that wasn't how life worked, but Daniel's hand, slick with blood, gripped his wrist with surprising strength. His eyes pleaded. More than that, commanded. "I swear it," Ethan said finally, his voice hoarse. "I'll find her. I'll take care of her." Daniel's fingers relaxed. His head turned toward the fading light, a peaceful look crossing his face. A final breath shuddered from his chest, and then he was still. For a long time, Ethan sat beside his fallen friend, unable to move. The prairie wind whispered through the tall grass, and the world seemed to fall silent around them. He'd seen men die before, but this one cut deeper. Daniel had been his brother in all but blood, and now Ethan had a promise to keep, one he didn't understand, and one that terrified him more than any battle ever had. That night, by the flickering campfire, Ethan buried Daniel beneath a lone pine tree. He marked the grave with a simple wooden cross and the words, "A loyal friend, a good man." Then he sat for hours staring into the flames, thinking of the woman Daniel had left behind, the sister who lived alone in the mountains, scarred, forgotten, and now utterly alone. He tried to picture her, but his mind refused. All he saw was the promise burning in his memory, etched into his conscience like a brand. By morning, when the frost had turned the grass white, Ethan saddled his horse. He glanced once more at the grave. "I'll keep my word, Daniel," he murmured, "even if it's the last thing I do." Then he turned his horse toward the distant hills, toward the unknown woman who carried his friend's name and his final wish. The road ahead was long, the winter biting and cruel, but the promise in Ethan's heart burned hotter than the cold. He didn't know what awaited him in the mountains, only that he would find her. Because a man's word, once given to the dying, was not a thing he could ever break. The mountains rose before Ethan like a wall of stone and ice. It took him 3 days of hard riding to reach the narrow pass that led to the Ward homestead, and by then the world had turned white beneath a late winter snow. Every mile was a reminder of the promise burning inside him, one he hadn't stopped questioning since the day Daniel died. He'd imagined her 100 ways, frail, broken, perhaps bitter from loneliness. He pictured a woman with her brother's eyes and quiet courage, but marked by tragedy. He didn't know what words he'd use when he found her. "I'm the man who promised your brother I'd take care of you." No matter how he phrased it, it sounded like pity. And he suspected Clara Ward was not the kind of woman who took kindly to that. By the time Ethan reached the cabin, snow clung to his coat and his horse was trembling with exhaustion. The small house stood half buried in drifts, smoke curling weakly from its chimney. He dismounted slowly, brushed the frost from his gloves, and approached the door. When he knocked, the door opened just an inch, held fast by a chain. A woman's voice, low but steady, called out, "Who are you?" "Name's Ethan Cole," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "I rode here from Fort Bridger. I knew your brother Daniel." The chain rattled, then the door opened wider. Ethan's breath caught. The woman before him wasn't what he expected. She was younger, perhaps mid-20s, but her eyes held the guarded wisdom of someone who'd seen too much. Her left cheek and neck bore the faint, shiny marks of old burns, half hidden beneath a loose strand of dark hair. But it wasn't the scars that struck him. It was the way she met his gaze. Unflinching. Unapologetic. "Daniel's dead," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. He asked me to come. Before he passed. Something flickered in her eyes. Grief, pain, maybe even anger, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You came a long way to deliver news I already knew." She opened the door fully, stepping aside. "You'd better come in before you freeze." Inside, the cabin was simple but warm, filled with the faint scent of pine and herbs. A small fire burned in the hearth and a patched quilt lay folded on a wooden chair. Everything about the place spoke of quiet strength, of someone who survived by their own hands. Ethan stood awkwardly, hat in hand. "He made me promise to look after you." Clara stiffened. "Did he now?" Her tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of long years spent fending off pity. "I suppose he thought I couldn't manage on my own." "That's not what he meant," Ethan said quickly. He cared for you, wanted you safe." Her expression softened just a little. "Daniel always worried too much." She turned to the window, watching the falling snow. "You kept your word. You came. You can go now." The words hit him harder than he expected. He could have left. He'd done what he promised. But something in her voice stopped him. Beneath that calm defiance, he heard loneliness, the kind he'd known himself too well. "I don't break promises halfway, Miss Ward," he said quietly. "If it's all right, I'll stay a while. Help with the wood, maybe fix that roof before the snow gets heavier." Clara hesitated. Then, after a long silence, she gave a small nod. "Suit yourself, but I don't need charity." Ethan smiled faintly. "Good thing I don't have any to give." For the first time, a hint of warmth crossed her face, so quick he almost missed it. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Inside that lonely cabin, two strangers, bound by a dying man's promise, stood on the edge of something neither of them yet understood. The days that followed settled into a quiet, uneasy rhythm. Ethan repaired the cabin's roof, split wood, and fed the fire when the nights turned bitter cold. Clara let him stay, reluctantly at first, though she treated him more like a tenant than a guest. She was polite but distant, her words clipped, her eyes always watchful. Ethan didn't mind. He'd seen enough hardship to recognize the armor people wore to keep from breaking. He never pressed her about the scars. But sometimes, when the firelight flickered just right, he saw how the burn marks pulled slightly when she smiled, or almost smiled, and it twisted something deep inside him. Each morning, she cooked plain meals of beans or cornbread, then went about her chores. She moved with quiet competence, strong and self-reliant. Ethan realized quickly that she wasn't the fragile woman Daniel had feared for. She was surviving in a world that had already taken almost everything from her. One morning, as snow drifted softly outside, Clara caught him mending a broken chair leg by the hearth. "You don't have to keep fixing things," she said. "You've already done more than your promise required." Ethan didn't look up. "Your brother didn't ask me to stop halfway," Clara sighed, setting down a basket of kindling. "Daniel was always making promises for other people. He had a good heart, but he never knew when to stop trying to save everyone. Ethan set the chair upright. Seems to me that kind of heart's rare. You should be proud. She glanced at him, her expression softening before she caught herself. Pride doesn't keep a person fed, she murmured. That night, the wind howled through the mountains and a storm rolled in fierce and fast. The cabin creaked beneath the force of it. Ethan kept the fire blazing, but when he turned, he found Clara shivering despite the heat. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a blanket around her shoulders. Clara, he said, kneeling beside her. You're burning up. It's nothing, she whispered. It happens sometimes when I've been out too long in the cold. He touched her forehead. It was blazing hot. You've got a fever. I'll be fine, she muttered, but her voice broke and a cough racked her chest. Without hesitation, Ethan lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed. She tried to protest, but her strength was gone. He sat beside her through the night, keeping a cool cloth on her brow. Whispering words meant more to calm himself than her. He'd lost one ward already. He wasn't about to lose another. By dawn, the fever broke. Clara stirred weakly, eyes half open. You shouldn't have stayed, she rasped. You don't owe me anything. Ethan looked at her, truly looked. The woman before him was not fragile, not helpless. She was worn by life, scarred but unyielding. And for the first time he understood what Daniel had seen in her, the fierce, quiet strength of someone who refused to give in to the cruelty of the world. I made your brother a promise, Ethan said softly. But I'm making this one to you. You won't face another winter alone. Not while I've got breath left in me. Clara's eyes widened, confusion flickering into fear. Ethan, what are you saying? I'm saying we should marry. He met her gaze steadily. Not out of pity, out of honor. I can help you keep this place. You'll have a home, protection, and my word you'll never be alone again. For a long moment, only the wind answered. Then Clara turned her face away, a single tear tracing down the unscarred side of her cheek. I don't need a husband born of duty, she whispered. Maybe not, he said, rising slowly, but you deserve a man who keeps his word. Outside, the storm began to ease. Inside, the silence between them grew heavier than the snow on the roof, an unspoken truth hanging in the air. Neither of them knew it yet, but that promise, the one spoken in the dim light of a mountain cabin, would bind their fates in ways neither could have imagined. The wedding took place in silence, under a gray morning sky, with only the preacher's voice and the wind through the pines as witnesses. Clara wore her mother's faded shawl, and Ethan stood beside her in a clean shirt he'd pressed with the back of a skillet. Neither smiled. It wasn't a day of joy, it was a day of honor. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Ethan only bowed his head slightly. Clara kept her eyes down, clutching the small silver locket Daniel had given her years before. They signed the paper, shook hands with the preacher, and then she walked back into the cabin alone. Ethan didn't follow right away. He stood for a moment beneath the cold mountain air, his hat pressed to his chest, wondering what kind of fool thought marriage could be built on a promise made to a dying man. Inside, Clara had already begun preparing supper as if nothing had changed. Her movements were brisk, mechanical. Ethan cleared his throat. You don't have to. I always cook in the evenings, she interrupted. That won't change just because there's a name on a paper. He nodded, quietly taking his seat. The air between them felt heavy, fragile. They ate in silence, the fire crackling, the only sound filling the space they didn't know how to cross. In the days that followed, Ethan moved his few belongings into the small room beside hers. He slept lightly, hearing her footsteps in the night, the creak of the floorboards when she woke from dreams she never spoke of. He longed to tell her she wasn't alone anymore, but he didn't know how to reach her without scaring her further into her shell. Their life together became one of quiet coexistence. Clara cooked and cleaned. Ethan worked the land, chopped wood, and repaired the barn. They spoke only when necessary. Yet beneath the surface something was shifting, something neither of them wanted to name. One evening, after a long day mending fences, Ethan came in to find Clara struggling with a heavy bucket of water. Without thinking, he crossed the room and took it from her hands. I can manage, she said sharply. I know you can, he replied softly, setting it down by the fire. Doesn't mean you have to. She froze, startled by the gentleness in his voice. For the first time, her guard slipped and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. "People look at me and see weakness," she said quietly. "I can't afford to need anyone." Ethan met her gaze. "Needing someone doesn't make you weak, Clara. It makes you human." Her breath caught, but she said nothing more. She turned back to her work, yet something in her expression had changed. Like a door cracked open a little. That night, as he lay awake listening to the storm outside, Ethan thought of how his life had turned out nothing like he'd planned. He'd imagined a wife chosen by love, not obligation. A home filled with laughter, not silence. But as he drifted toward sleep, he realized that somehow, this cabin, with its single flickering lantern and the soft sound of Clara moving in the next room, felt more like home than anywhere else he'd ever been. Weeks passed, and the land began to thaw. Together they planted a small garden, side by side in the cold spring soil. Clara didn't smile often, but sometimes when the light caught her face just right, Ethan caught glimpses of warmth, fragile, fleeting, but real. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he found her standing on the porch staring out over the valley. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Regret what?" "Marrying me." She didn't look at him. "I don't know yet," she said after a long pause. "Ask me when I can tell if you mean it." He didn't press her. He only nodded, understanding that trust was not something she could give easily or quickly. Inside the small cabin, a lamp burned against the growing dark, a fragile flame that refused to die out. Two strangers bound by duty shared that light, and somewhere deep beneath their guarded hearts, the first seeds of something truer than obligation began to stir. Spring came slowly to the mountains, melting the snow in hesitant trickles that carved narrow paths down the slopes. The land began to breathe again, green shoots pushing through the thaw, birds returning to the pines. Yet inside the cabin, the air between Ethan and Clara was still cautious, fragile. They had learned each other's silences, but not yet each other's hearts. Ethan worked long hours repairing the fences and clearing fallen trees. Clara tended the garden, often humming softly to herself when she thought he wasn't listening. Sometimes he caught her watching him from the porch, her expression unreadable, half wary, half wistful. One afternoon, while mending the barn roof, Ethan overheard voices coming from the road below. Two men from town had come to trade supplies, but their words carried too easily in the mountain air. "Can't believe he married her," one said with a low chuckle. "Poor fool probably didn't know what she looked like till after the wedding." The other laughed. "A woman that scarred ought to keep to herself. Folks say she burned half her own house down years ago, killed her mother in the fire." Ethan froze. The hammer in his hand felt suddenly heavy. A slow anger built in his chest, not just at their cruelty, but at his own ignorance. He climbed down the ladder, ready to tell them to leave, but Clara appeared first. She stood by the gate, her back straight, her chin high. "You've said enough," she said, her voice calm but sharp as broken glass. "You can take your supplies and go. We've nothing else to trade." The men shifted uneasily, muttered something under their breath, and rode off. When the sound of their horses faded, Clara turned toward the cabin. Ethan started to speak, but she held up a hand. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't ask." That night neither of them slept much. The next morning, Ethan found her sitting outside with her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, staring at the mountains. He sat down beside her, waiting. The silence stretched until finally she spoke. "It's true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about the fire." He turned to her slowly, but she didn't meet his eyes. "I was 16, she continued. Father had been drinking. He'd left a lantern burning in the loft. I smelled the smoke too late." Her hands twisted in her lap. "I tried to get my mother out, but the flames came too fast. I remember the heat, the sound of the roof giving way." She swallowed hard. "She didn't make it, I did. That's my punishment, I suppose." Ethan's throat tightened. "You were a child, Clara, that wasn't your fault." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Try telling that to the town. They needed someone to blame. Father left not long after, too ashamed to stay. Daniel joined the army to escape it. And I stayed here, with the ghosts." Ethan wanted to reach for her to offer comfort, but he knew pity would wound her more than silence. Instead, he said quietly, "You didn't burn that house down. You survived it." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Then softly, "Daniel used to say the same thing. He was the only one who didn't look at me like I was a reminder of everything we'd lost. She turned to face Ethan then, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Now you know what kind of woman you married. He held her gaze. I know exactly what kind, he said. One with more courage than anyone I've ever met. Her lips parted, a breath caught in her throat, but she said nothing more. She only turned away, wiping at her cheek as if brushing off the wind. Ethan stayed beside her until the sun dipped behind the peaks, neither speaking again. But in that silence, something shifted, something deep and real. He had thought his promise was a burden of honor, but now he saw it for what it truly was, a chance to help a woman carry the weight she'd been forced to bear alone for far too long. Summer came to the mountains in a burst of gold and green. The meadows bloomed with wildflowers, and the wardland, once nearly abandoned, was alive again under Ethan's steady hands and Clara's quiet diligence. Yet peace never lasted long on the frontier. One afternoon, Ethan returned from the trading post with his jaw tight and his knuckles white. Clara was kneeling in the garden, her hands buried in the soil. She looked up when she heard the horse's hooves crunch over the dry earth. What happened? She asked, sensing the storm in his face. He dismounted slowly, removed his hat, and said, There's talk in town. The men who run the survey office claim this land isn't yours anymore, that Daniel sold it before the war. Clara froze. That's a lie. I know, Ethan said grimly. But they've got papers, real or forged, I can't tell. A man named Barrett means to claim it. Says the land falls under his new cattle range. Barrett. She knew the name. A rancher with too much power and too little conscience. He'd offered to buy the land from her years ago, and when she refused, he'd spread rumors that she was unfit to manage it. I'll ride down and settle it, Ethan said. No, she said quickly, standing. You don't owe me that fight. He met her eyes, steady and unyielding. I made a promise to your brother to protect you. And this? He gestured toward the cabin, the garden, the valley beyond. This is part of you. No one's taking it while I'm breathing. Clara stared at him, her chest tight. She wanted to tell him not to risk himself, but the conviction in his voice silenced her. He wasn't doing this out of pity or duty anymore. She could feel it. 2 days later, Ethan rode to town to confront Barrett. The saloon fell quiet when he stepped through the doors. Barrett was at the poker table, cigar smoke curling above his head. Cole, Barrett drawled. Didn't expect to see you off that mountain. You hear about the Ward property? I'm here about the lies you've been spreading, Ethan said, his tone calm but dangerous. That land was never yours and you know it. Barrett smirked. Paper says otherwise. He flicked a document across the table. Signed by Daniel Ward himself. Ethan picked it up, scanning the scrawled signature. That's not his hand. I served with him. I saw him write 100 times, Barrett shrugged. Then take it up with the law. But I'll warn you, lawmen tend to listen to the man with the bigger purse. Ethan's jaw clenched. Maybe, but sometimes they listen to the man who's right. When he returned home, his face was bruised and blood dried at his collar. Clara met him on the porch, her breath catching. Ethan, what happened? He waved her worry aside. Just words that got loud. Her eyes burned. You fought for me? He hesitated, then said softly, No. I fought for what's ours. She turned away, but her shoulders trembled. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, a small touch, yet it carried more than words. For the first time, she didn't pull away. Over the next week, threats came. Strangers rode near the property at night, and once they found the barn door hacked open. Ethan stayed awake by the fire with his rifle across his knees. When Clara brought him coffee, he looked up and said, You should sleep. So should you, she murmured, setting the cup down beside him. But you won't, will you? He smiled faintly. Not while someone's trying to take what I swore to protect. That night she sat beside him until the fire burned low, the two of them silent beneath the crackle of the flames. For the first time she realized that Ethan wasn't staying because of Daniel, or even because of his promise. He was staying because, somewhere along the line, she had become the reason. The night it happened, the sky was copper red, one of those strange mountain twilights that looked almost like fire. Ethan had gone to check the lower pasture, where the fence had been cut again. Clara waited on the porch, her stomach twisting with worry. For days now she'd sensed it. Something coming, something wrong, she was right. It began with the smell. Faint at first, then stronger. Smoke. By the time she turned, the barn was already ablaze, flames licking high into the darkening sky. The same sound she'd heard years ago filled her ears again. The roar of fire devouring wood, the crackle of dry hay. For a heartbeat, she couldn't move. The world tilted. She was 16 again, trapped inside that inferno, her mother's screams echoing through the smoke. Then she heard Ethan's voice shouting her name. "Clara, get back!" But she didn't. Not this time, not again. Her legs moved before her mind caught up. She ran toward the flames, pulling her shawl tight around her mouth. Inside the barn, the horses thrashed wildly against their stalls. She grabbed a rope, coughing through the smoke, and began untying them one by one. Ethan burst through the doors moments later, his face streaked with soot. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted, grabbing her arm. "I'm not leaving them," she cried, dragging another rope free. "They'll burn." He cursed under his breath but didn't argue. Together, they led the terrified animals into the open, choking and gasping for air. When the last horse stumbled out, Clara turned to see the rafters above them glowing red, ready to collapse. Ethan lunged forward, caught her around the waist, and pulled her clear as the roof gave way in a shower of sparks. They fell to the ground together, the force knocking the breath from her lungs. She blinked up at the sky, orange light flickering against the night, and realized her hands were trembling uncontrollably. Ethan was beside her, breathing hard, his arm still around her as though he couldn't let go. "It's gone," she whispered, staring at the smoldering wreckage. "Everything's gone." "No," he said softly, turning her face toward him. "Not everything." For a long moment, neither spoke. The firelight danced across their faces, reflecting in her tear-streaked eyes. She felt his thumb brush away a streak of ash from her cheek. The tenderness of it undid her completely. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured. "I ran as soon as I saw the smoke. I thought, God, Clara, I thought it was happening all over again." She looked up at him, confusion and pain warring inside her. "You shouldn't have come back for me." "I'll always come back for you," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Don't you understand yet? I didn't marry you for Daniel. I didn't stay here out of duty. I stayed because I love you." The words hung between them like the first light after a long storm. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Tears filled her eyes. Not of sorrow, but of something deeper, something terrifying and pure. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "You can't." Ethan shook his head. "You think I'd risk my life, my land, my name for a promise? You're the bravest soul I've ever known, Clara. You make me want to be better. You make this place home." She stared at him, the world blurring through her tears. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. "All my life," she said quietly, "I've been afraid. Of fire, of faces, of being seen. But when you say things like that, I'm not afraid anymore." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the last embers of the fire faded into the night. Around them the horses whickered softly, the wind carrying away the scent of smoke. For the first time in years, Clara felt the weight of her past begin to lift. Love hadn't erased her scars. It had made her strong enough to live beyond them. And as Ethan held her beneath the burning sky, she knew. This was no longer a marriage born of promise. It was a life born of choice. The days after the fire were quiet, almost sacred. The barn lay in blackened ruins, but somehow the land still breathed. The fields still shimmered with morning dew, and the mountains still stood watch in the distance. Clara and Ethan moved among the ashes side by side, rebuilding plank by plank, word by word. There was grief, yes, but there was also peace, the kind that only comes when everything false has already burned away. At dawn, Clara would rise early to feed the horses that had survived. She'd braid their manes and hum softly to them, her hands steady and sure. Ethan would meet her there, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. They didn't speak much at first. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full. Every evening as the sun dipped low, Ethan would glance toward the porch where Clara sat sewing, the firelight touching her scarred cheek. Once he'd looked away, afraid of his own tenderness. Now, he let himself stare. He loved that face. The strength in it, the honesty, the way her eyes caught the light and turned it to warmth. Weeks passed before he finally asked her what had been weighing on him. "Do you ever regret it?" he said one night, voice quiet against the hum of the crickets. "Marrying me? Living here? Daniel's promise." Clara set down her sewing and looked up. "Do you?" He shook his head, eyes steady. "No, not once, but I've wondered if you do." She thought of Daniel, his pale face in those final moments, his hand gripping Ethan's as he whispered, "Promise me. She won't be alone." She thought of how strange it had felt to walk into a life not her own, bound to a man she barely knew, but that wasn't their story anymore. "I used to," she admitted softly. "In the beginning. I thought you pitied me, that you only married me because of him." She hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. "But then you showed me what love looks like when it's quiet, when it stays. And now," her voice faltered, "now I thank him for making you promise." Ethan's throat tightened. He reached across the small table and took her hand, rough palm to gentle fingers. "You were never a burden, Clara. You were the blessing I didn't know I needed." For a long while they sat there, hands entwined, the night stretching soft around them. When spring came, the ranch began to bloom again. A new barn stood where the old one had fallen, stronger, built by both of them. Clara hung wildflowers over the doorway in memory of Daniel, a simple tribute to the man who had brought her here, and to the life that had grown from his last wish. On a warm afternoon, Clara rode into town with Ethan. For the first time, she walked down the main street without her shawl pulled tight over her face. Heads turned, whispers followed, but she didn't shrink away. Instead, she lifted her chin, smiled at the curious glances, and kept walking. Ethan watched her with quiet pride. To him, she had always been beautiful, but now she carried herself like she knew it too. That evening, when they returned home, she found a letter waiting on the porch. The handwriting was old and familiar, Daniel's, written before he passed. Her hands trembled as she read it aloud. "If you're reading this, it means Ethan kept his word. Don't be afraid to love him, Clara. He's got a good heart, and you've got the courage to heal it." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she smiled through them. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "He was right," she whispered. "We both healed each other." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "We kept the promise." They stood together, watching the last light fade over the valley, their land, their home, their second chance. For the first time since the fire, the world felt whole again. And for Clara, the girl who once hid her face from the world, there was no more fear, only love, and the quiet certainty that she had been chosen not out of duty, but out of destiny. The promise had been made in sorrow, but it was kept in love.